Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the Strait of Hormuz being closed after Trump and Iran's foreign minister said it was completely open, suggesting the U.S. is not talking to the right people and that if anyone is in control of the Iranian government, it's the Revolutionary Guard Corps. Joining us to assess whether the war will resume when the ceasefire ends on Wednesday is Juan, a professor of modern Middle Eastern and South Asian history at the University of Michigan. He's also the author of the blog Informed Comment at juancole.com and the author Engaging the Muslim World, Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires, and most recently Gaza Yet Stands. We will discuss his latest articles at Informed Comment, Iran's Strait of Hormuz is open but with conditions, and South Korea, Asia, livid about Israeli role in fuel crisis. Then, with Trump forcing Netanyahu's hand, saying Israel is, quote, prohibited from bombing Lebanon, we'll look into domestic pressure on Israel's prime minister from an overwhelming percentage of Israelis who want the Israeli Defense Forces to finish the job and wipe out Hezbollah, which the Lebanese government appears unable to bring under control. Joining us is Thanassis Cambanis, a senior fellow at the Century Foundation and director of the Center for International Research and Policy. Until recently, he worked as a journalist based in Lebanon, and his books include A Privilege to Die, Inside Hezbollah's Legions and Their Endless War Against Israel, Once Upon a Revolution, An Egyptian Story, and most recently, Shia Power Comes of Age, The Transformation of Islamist Politics in Iraq, 2003 to 2023. Then finally, we'll examine what can be done to remove an increasingly mentally ill Trump from office when the only mechanism available requires a gutless Vance and a craven and cowardly Republican Congress to invoke the 25th Amendment. Joining us to discuss how to intervene when a mental patient needs to be committed is Dr. Alan Francis, a professor emeritus and former chair of psychiatry and behavioral science at Duke University. He's the author of the award-winning international bestseller Saving Normal and the reference work Essentials of Psychiatric Diagnosis, and his latest book is Twilight of American Sanity, a psychiatrist analyzes the age of Trump, now out in an updated paperback version. And before we begin, with Trump having bombed 7 countries and started a war against Iran, while at home his ICE thugs terrorize and break up families, murdering American citizens in the process, the need to rid the country of the deeply unpopular Trump kakistocracy and his clown car cabinet could not be more urgent. But these crooks and criminals would do anything to stay in power as their billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media and the mob boss intimidates Republican politicians. Only people power can beat money power, and we need all hands on deck as we continue to do our part delivering a daily public service providing the facts and evidence to inform the majority of what they are up against and how to win back our country, our decency, and the respect of the community of nations. You can help save America's 250-year-old democracy by making a tax-deductible donation at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org, and thank you. And joining us now is Juan, who's a professor of modern Middle Eastern and South Asian history at the University of Michigan. He's also the author of the blog Informed Comment at juancole.com and the author of Engaging the Muslim World, Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires, and most recently Gaza Yet Stands. His latest articles at Informed Comment include Iran, Strait of Hormuz is open but with conditions, and South Korea, Asia, livid about Israeli role in fuel crisis. Welcome to Background Briefing, Juan.
Thank you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And both Trump and Iran's foreign minister said that the Straits of Hormuz were, quote, completely open. Then they obviously are not, which suggests that the U.S. is not talking to the right people, and along with, of course, the Pakistanis, who are the intermediaries. And it would seem to me, Juan, that if anybody's in control of the Iranian government, it's the Revolutionary Guard Corps. What do you think?
Yes, the Revolutionary Guards Corps is the leading authority in the country. However, what I would say is that because of the U.S. and Israeli tactic of assassinating leaders, the the government of the late Ayatollah Ali Khamenei devolved authority. This is not unheard of even in the U.S. military. If a unit is out in the field and is cut off from command, they might give the lieutenant his head, say, you make the decision on the ground. So a lot of that has been done in Iran. Lower level commanders seem to have much more leeway to make command decisions in the field than was possible earlier, which means that we're not dealing with a united Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps with a firm line of command. For all we know, some wild guy in southwestern Iran has decided to, attack an Indian tanker. It may not be coming from the top. And so when someone like the civilian foreign minister, who's very far away from those centers of military power, says something, who knows what authority he has to say it.
Right, and some of the demonstrations inside of Iran, the pro-regime demonstrations, along with their ritual chant of death to America, death to Israel, death to the compromisers. So is that possibly going on, that the IRGC hardcore consider people like Agachi, the foreign minister, a compromiser?
Absolutely. There are factions inside the IRGC who feel that way. And this is not new. They felt that way about Javad Zarif, Arakchi's one of his predecessors, when he was negotiating with Obama. However, what is new is that in the old days, if the clerical leader, Khamenei, decided to back someone like Arakchi, then the IRGC would go along. And now the leader seems to be injured, and it's not clear what role he is playing, and the IRGC is much more decentralized, so that the hardliners in a way have more power and certainly can act as spoilers more than was the case in the past.
So all of this, I think it's reasonable, surely, that the Iranians should not be able to force a toll system on the Strait of Hormuz. It used to be a open to all traffic, free and open international seaway before this war. But then you can, I guess, blame both Netanyahu and Trump for starting the war. And the fact that they bombed the hell out of the place, which is obviously what Netanyahu's strategy is, just to simply destroy Iran, and Trump went along with that. And the Iranians are now saying, well, we need the money from the toll to rebuild. And of course, part of their negotiation is that they want the U.S. to pay reparations, which are highly unlikely. So does this lead you to conclude, Juan, that from the beginning, if anything, the U.S. should have had a blockade if Iran was insisting on exacting a toll rather than bombing the place? And the reason they bombed the place was that the Israelis dragged them into it?
Well, Ian, the whole thing is a huge geopolitical mistake, perhaps the worst since the Iraq War, and maybe the worst in American history. The Iranians were not collecting any tolls from passage through the Strait of Hormuz before the Israelis and the United States attacked them, and I had never heard of the idea. The Iranians had always pledged that were they to be attacked, they would close the strait. But, there's an article now in The Nation that by an international law specialist who argues that actually there may be a case for these Iranian tolls. Certainly, Iran, even under U.S. law, where we in the U.S. we claim 12 miles off of our shore, the Strait of Hormuz is narrow. So even under U.S. rules, which are much more restricted than most countries, Iran ought to be able to charge tolls for people, for tankers going through its seas. And many countries claim much more than 12 miles. And under those rules, Iran might have a claim. So the international legal disputes about these things, of course, are subordinate to, as you say, the military realities. The military reality is that Iran can now act as a spoiler. It can sabotage passage through the Strait, not only through its drones, but simply through fear. Because these huge tankers are worth billions, and they will not ply the waters unless they're insured. I mean, if you had several $billion wrapped up in one of these ships, you wouldn't want to expose it to the danger of sinking because all your money would be gone unless it was insured. And now Lloyd's of London and the other big insurers are refusing to insure ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. So it is these legal mechanisms and the threat of force that are most pertinent to understanding the current situation. And it is not a situation that can be resolved by the U.S. blockading Iran or threatening naval force. Because the possibility of sabotage and the fear and the lack of insurance are all going to remain in place.
Well, it seems like the Iranians have the upper hand because nobody quite knows what the extent of the mining is. But the Iranians are saying if you come through this particular passageway, you're safe from mines, and this is one that takes them close to Larak Island, where they pay the toll. So it looks like they've got the situation under control, whereas the U.S. has about 15 warships in the Gulf of Oman on the other side of the Strait, stopping anything that goes in or out. But it's pretty clear that the Iranians have the upper hand.
They do, and although the United States has come back at them with this blockade of Iranian shipping, the Iranians have a cushion. They can certainly last such a blockade for a couple months. Ian, the West cannot last another 2 months of this. I can't understand why it is, but I don't have the impression that the American political elite and U.S. media have their hair on fire about this in the way that it ought to be. You know, there's looming food shortages, there's jet fuel shortages, there's gasoline shortages, and these are hitting Asia first, but they're coming for everybody.
Well, but you've got people like Vance and company, Hegseth and Trump, who just hate the Europeans. They don't care. And Trump's got a meeting with Xi coming up. I mean, I'm sure she's going to roll him like they always do. Every foreign leader is able to roll this guy because he's such an idiot and he's such an amateur. But the crisis in South Korea, Japan is extraordinary. I mentioned Australia's running out of jet fuel. So is the Europeans. You know, apparently South Koreans, as you point out in your article, Juan, have found some 18 million barrels from Kazakhstan. The Saudis do have a pipeline across the country to Yanbu on the Red Sea, but already in retaliation, just before this ceasefire began, actually while the first day of the ceasefire, the Iranians fired a salvo of drones that hit the pumping station on the Gulf that feeds that pipeline. So it's pretty clear how the Iranians can escalate, right? They can destroy the Gulf states' productions of oil and gas, which would take years to undo, and that would turn a global recession into a depression.
Yes, well, they have already done damage. The French estimate that a third of the Gulf refinery capacity has been damaged. The Iranians won't want to destroy too many of rigs of other countries because then they're vulnerable to riposte. But as long as this thing goes on, the crisis is looming, and it's not just going to hit Asia and Europe. It already is affecting the United States, and it will affect it more badly. You know, there's a fertilizer shortage because natural gas is a feedstock for fertilizer, and the Qataris supplied a fifth of the liquefied natural gas, and they're not producing. They turned off the spigot. So there's something like 4 million acres of corn that are not going to be planted this spring because the farmers just don't have fertilizer. And it's not just corn. It goes all through the economy. In the United States, and this, of course, is affecting people in other countries as well, there's going to be food shortages over this. And then they use corn to feed beef. So that, all of these food commodities are going to skyrocket for the next year. And the longer the Strait remains closed, the deeper the damage. And the United States is not going, just because it has its own petroleum, there's this meme out there that people fall for, that the U.S. doesn't have to worry about the Strait, doesn't get oil from there, and it has its own. This is not true. This is not the way the world works. The United States, first of all, doesn't produce all of its own petroleum. It imports. And it also, for various reasons, it exports. The pressure, upward pressure on prices, is not going to leave the U.S. market untouched. So there's going to be very expensive gasoline, jet fuel, as you say, and diesel. And diesel is important because it runs trucks, and our food gets delivered to the grocery store on trucks. All of this is going to work itself into the U.S. economy, so that we're facing a severe economic crisis. The United States economy was already downgraded from an expected growth of 2.4% to only 0.7% this year. And every $10 a barrel increase in the price of petroleum takes a tenth of a point off of the GDP. So we're talking about a very real possibility of this fall going into a recession.
Well, you could look at it, and in fact, I spoke the other day with Robert Pape at the University of Chicago, who's been very prescient on this whole catastrophe. He said, it's one thing for the price of oil to go up, but the next stage is when you simply don't get any oil or gas. And already the Philippines is in that situation. South Korea is heading in that situation. I mentioned Australia's running out of jet fuel, so is Europe. So that's the new domino, isn't it?
Yes, and people should remember that the rest of the world is furious about this war. They cannot understand why anybody would be crazy enough to launch it. They're very angry with Israel and with Trump. And, South Korea is under enormous pressure from North Korea, and ordinarily, couldn't be more nice to Washington. They just typically full of praise and put their heads down. And the president of South Korea slammed Netanyahu over this war, and also, accused the Israelis of widespread human rights violations. Everybody thinks that Netanyahu here is standing in as a proxy for Trump himself, that the South Koreans are very upset. They've managed to scrape together about 3 months of supply of gasoline and diesel. Ian, if this thing goes on very much longer and you get to the end of that supply, South Korea could simply, as Pape says, have no gasoline. No possibility of filling up your tank and going to work.
Right, and also be very vulnerable to North Korea, which is promising to attack them at 24/7. So
that's right, and moreover, the anti-missile missiles, the THAADs that South Korea was protected by, were all moved to protect Israel because it launched this war on Iran. So South Korea is a sitting duck at the moment.
So on Wednesday, this ceasefire ends. Will the war resume? The IRGC just fired, as you mentioned, an Indian tanker and a UK-flagged container ship. So it's just likely to get worse, isn't it? Any spark could set this whole thing off. And I would think after Wednesday, all bets are off. And by the way, every time Trump makes an announcement, either whether it's magic, it seems like magical thinking, but maybe there's a cynical component to it, which is him and his family are selling short on the stock market and making fortunes because of the zigzagging, whipsawing announcements of the straits are open, the straits are closed. What do you think of? Is that possibly going on?
Well, it seems very clearly going on. It's clear that somebody is making bets on the stock market and with insider knowledge about announcements that Trump is going to be making. Moreover, Trump is manipulating the market, which is at the moment in an AI bubble and is disconnected from reality. It's puzzling to all of the oil people as to why, although the spot market in oil is high, if you want to just go out and buy a barrel, it could cost you $145 a barrel. But they're estimating out 6 months that it'll go back to normal. Well, Ian, it's not going back to normal. The oil is going to stay high for at least a year off of this crisis, and it's going to take a long time for the Gulf countries to get back up to speed. They have to repair things. At the moment, we don't know when this crisis is going to end. So there's this odd disconnect between the market and the finance people. And what the physical oil people are saying about the likelihood of this being a prolonged crisis in energy. I lived through the 1970s crisis when we had to stand in line for a couple hours to get gasoline, and we're likely going back to that.
Well, Juan Cole, thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Juan Cole, who's Professor of Modern Middle Eastern and South Asian History at the University of Michigan. He's also the author of the blog Informed Comment at juancole.com and the author of Engaging the Muslim World, Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires, and most recently, Gaza Yet Stands. And his latest articles at Informed Comment include Iran, Straits of Hormuz is open, but with conditions, and South Korea, Asia, livid about Israeli role in fuel crisis. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking at how Trump apparently forced Netanyahu's hand by saying Israel is prohibited from bombing Lebanon. But clearly, Netanyahu is under domestic pressure from the Israeli public who want the IDF to finish the job and wipe out Hezbollah.
Hi. Trader sailed a jeweled crown. Humanity rode the wave. Exploring to command more land. Scheming how to rule the waves. Trader spied a virgin plain and named it for velvet robes. Rode home declaring there's a place where totally folks are free. Nourishment fills the prairies and the hillside.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Thanassis Cambanis, who's a senior fellow of the Century Foundation and director of the Center for International Research and Policy. Until recently, he worked as a journalist based in Lebanon, and his books include A Privileged to Die, Inside Hezbollah's Legions and Their Endless War Against Israel, Once Upon a Revolution, An Egyptian Story, and most recently, Shia Power Comes of Age, The Transformation of Islamist Politics in Iraq, 2003 to 2023. Welcome to Background Briefing, Thanassis
Always good to
Cambanis.
talk to you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And the Trump administration's announced that they're sending a delegation to Pakistan on Monday for talks, resuming another round of talks with Iran. The Iranians haven't said that they're sending a delegation as of yet, but given that recently Trump told Netanyahu and twisted his arm, obviously, saying he's prohibited from bombing Lebanon, I find it pretty rich that after years of the United States insisting that Iran was the problem in all of the Middle East, from Gaza to Lebanon, in Iraq, and also in Yemen with their proxies, Trump's now saying that in terms of the Hezbollah-Israel dispute, that's just a separate skirmish from the U.S. war on Iran. So suddenly Iran is not the problem in terms of its proxies, at least at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously an opportunistic gloss on both Trump and Israel's interest in sort of seeing what they can get away with in a maximalist war against all the different entities that they have objections to or strategic problems with in the wider region. Now, it's been very interesting to watch the efforts by a lot of sides in this conflict to try and exclude what's happening in Lebanon from the wider ceasefire. So, as I'm sure your listeners know well, the day after the ceasefire was announced, more than 10 days ago now, immediately afterwards, Israel unleashed its greatest barrage of bombs yet. I think 100 strikes in 10 minutes across Lebanon, really cataclysmic. And it looked from the outside to me like this was an Israeli effort to do two problematic things. One, to continue ethnic cleansing and extending their occupation in Lebanon, but two, to try and derail the entire ceasefire, the wider ceasefire between Iran and the US, which clearly had been meant to include Lebanon. And my read on what happened in the subsequent week and a half was Trump and Netanyahu, they kind of wanted to see if they could get away with this, right? If the war in Lebanon could continue, if the Iranians would accept that. The Iranians ultimately didn't. And Trump finally, it seems, called up Bibi Netanyahu and said, you've got to dial it back in Lebanon. And the biggest indication that we have that this is a sort of man-to-man pressure is that when Netanyahu did sort of extend his lukewarm acceptance of the idea of some kind of nominal ceasefire and an agreement of peace talks with Lebanon, he didn't go to the Security Cabinet of Israel to get their support for this. He just announced it unilaterally, and that's the kind of thing that happens when we see these man-to-man deals between the two bros in chief, Netanyahu and Trump.
Well, but that relationship has, this has always been, and for me, somebody that tries to follow foreign policy and global politics, etc., it's always been extraordinary. And I've talked to a lot of people in Washington, in the State Department and the CIA and other agencies, the Pentagon. It's amazing the influence that Israel's had over the United States. This small country has more influence than just about any other country on the planet, gets more aid. It's the biggest recipient of U.S. aid. Has incredible influence over the Congress, and now it's sort of come home to roost that most of the world now is angry at Israel because they're having to pay more for energy, and they're running out of it too, which is going to cause tremendous economic crisis if this thing's not solved in the Gulf. The Asians are suffering, as which in our earlier segment on today's program, Juan was pointing out how the South Koreans are furious with Israel. So this seems to be happening across the world. The very puzzlement that I've always had about how come this tiny little country seems to be the most important country in American politics is now becoming a global issue where the rest of the world is saying, how come you got us into this mess?
Yeah, I mean, this is so, it's so hard to parse and talk about. And of course, any kind of discussion along these lines subjects people in public life to withering accusations of anti-Semitism, right? So after, for example, this war began, many elected officials in the U.S. who were critical of the war said what I think seems obvious. They said Israel dragged the U.S. into a war that's not in the U.S.'s interest. And that very, very directly subjected those people. I'm thinking people like Senator Chris Murphy or Van Hollen or others who are in no way anti-Semitic and in no way are making a claim that's hard to defend. Still had to kind of prove that they're not making some kind of anti-Semitic tail wagging the dog argument. Now I see a couple of deeper problems here that you're getting at in what you say, but I think are actually worse and harder to resolve. So I think, one, the United States has really come to serially mistake Israel's interests for its own and make poor policy choices as a result. But there's another kind of toxic trend in American policy thinking, which is that they have adopted the Israeli approach to conflict management, right? So the longstanding Israeli approach in the region since the mid 70s, and it's really accelerated in the last 10 or 20 years, has been to kind of embrace a state of perpetual conflict, and to view rivals or challengers as competitors to either try to eradicate or just to accept that every so many years they'll be in conflicts in which most of what they're doing is targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, and that is how they manage the security environment around them in the Middle East. As again, I think your listeners know, I think that's a terrible, inhumane, and also doomed approach. But that is the chosen approach. Trump's administration seems to have bought into this worldview completely, right? So the war on Iran last summer, and then the war that just started now, there's no rational, or sorry, I shouldn't say rational, there's no reasonable or substantiated way to look at this as being somehow in the US's interest, right? I mean, tanking global oil markets, upending global alliances, making literally every country in the world think of the United States as a rogue actor. All of these things, just from a very clinical, dispassionate perspective, are bad for American power. And yet, in keeping with this kind of Israeli approach, Trump seems to think this will make the world fear American power, and that will, in some magical thinking way, rebound with an increase in prestige, wealth, influence, and security power for the United States. I don't see any evidence for this theory of the case, but I think that is the mindset, and it will, I think, lead to a similar kind of position for the United States in the world as Israel has had in its region, namely that of a maximalist, destabilizing rogue state that obeys no rules, that is feared and disliked by its neighbors, that can make transactional alliances with people in need, but never out of shared common sense of project and values. And it really forsakes the prospect of the kind of alliance making that had historically been the hallmark of the United States. The United States used to be a country people wanted to partner with because they liked what it stood for, and even with all its hypocrisy and various black marks on U.S. intervention in the world, the U.S. was understood to be a force for good, for wealth, for rights, for democracy, and we can quibble with how true that was. And now we are kind of a unhinged state. And I would say, last thought on this riff, that as adversaries mirror each other over time, and we've seen Israel and Hezbollah, Israel and Iran behave more and more like each other in their conflicts with each other. I see the United States behaving more like these rogue Middle Eastern states than one would have thought possible, given how powerful the country is.
Well, Trump is now saying to the Iranians, "No more Mr. Nice Guy," threatening to blow up their power stations and their bridges. But at the end of the day, with all of this sort of posturing, and after all, Trump is really not about making headway so much as making headlines. And he's going to lose. The United States is not going to win this thing. They've already lost. From day one, they've lost this ridiculous, misbegotten war. So it's going to end up as a black eye. But what's happening in Israel is interesting, because the opposition in Israel were all in favor of the war. But then now they're turning against Netanyahu for not finishing the job and for making a total mess of it. And now you've got the Israeli public, I think by a two-thirds, three-quarters majority, wanting the IDF to finish the job. And I don't know how you can bomb Hezbollah into submission.
Yeah, I mean, these are views that are completely unmoored from what's realistically possible, right? So we're talking about public opinion in the case of Israel that wants a continuing war, and finish the job is probably a misnomer, because the kind of total open-ended war that they're interested in and committing to does not have an end. It doesn't have a finishing point. It's not, the idea is not that one big burst of warfare in another 6 months or a year can end this conflict for good and clear it up. It is an embrace of an idea that you just have perpetual war with your neighbors. And the plans that they propose for Lebanon are mind-bogglingly illegal, immoral, and strategically bonkers. They are talking about completely clearing out miles and miles of the border area where hundreds of thousands of people live, destroying every house and infrastructure there, and creating something like the DMZ in Korea, 6 kilometers of completely uninhabited area occupied by Israeli soldiers in perpetuity, and then another 6 kilometers of uninhabited area in which Israel would claim right to free maneuver to kill or displace anyone who enters that area. That is, I mean, a strategic expert can tell you this is upside. It can't happen. It is impossible. But this is the kind of plan they're talking about. And I would say the other really interesting instance of being detached from reality is Trump's idea that he can somehow extract a victory from this crazy set of circumstances he created that's been terrible for the world and terrible for the United States, right? The United States is worse off in every way than it was before Trump started this elective war. And the kind of the ridiculous discourse around opening the Strait of Hormuz, which he triggered the closure of, is a real sign of this. There, as you said, there's no victory to be had here. I mean, it's catastrophe in general, but it is a distinct loss for the United States, the likes of which I think has never been seen in modern history.
But how do you deal with Iran and Hezbollah? I mean, in Hezbollah's case, they started this latest round in early March in response to the Israeli-American killing of Iran's supreme leader. So you can see how much they are an Iranian proxy, and they fired missiles into Israel, and Israel came back with a vengeance. And then if you go back to October 7, with the Hamas attack and slaughtering Israeli citizens and civilians, that has changed the Israeli attitude. If there was ever any chance that they wanted to have a peace, and it was pretty clear that Netanyahu never did, he undermined it as much as he could, and it was basically on life support, the peace process. Now there's just absolutely no, I mean, it seems to me that the consensus now in Israel is you just can't deal with these people. You got to
Right.
kill them.
I mean, that's the consensus, and it's, again, it's unhinged. So to start, of course, Hezbollah is a bad actor, right? They are a destabilizing. I don't think they're a pure proxy of Iran. They have a very tight relationship with Iran, mutual interdependence, shared unappealing goals, but they have their own very deep national constituency. There's no way to erase them from Lebanese political life or society. They will always be a serious and maybe predominant armed actor inside Lebanon. Now, all that said, we know how to deal with them because Israel and Lebanon, Israel and Hezbollah had a very durable, long, secure peace from 2008 until 2023, when the Hamas war began. And we can argue about how the relative culpability that all the different parties involved had in triggering the spread of that conflict to Lebanon. But what we are looking at there is at least a 15-year, very secure peace between this bad actor Hezbollah and this other kind of rogue state actor Israel. So we know it can be done. These troublesome actors can find equilibrium that is stable and non-conflictual. So what we have today is this debate between a fantastical, really unhinged, magical thinking trend, which is, can Israel eliminate Hezbollah? Can it crush Iran and turn it into a Stone Age, a shadow of itself that can't cause problems? And the answer to that is no, and it's been tried. It's been tried over and over, and the argument each time is, I mean, with Hezbollah, with Lebanon, Israel tried to do this starting in 1978, leading to the creation of Hezbollah, and then it occupied Lebanon till 2000 and was driven out by Hezbollah. And for sure, if it tries to occupy Lebanon again, that will happen again. There's no mechanical way that there's not some amount of force, some infinite amount of force that can dislodge or eliminate this group from its own society. And so the argument is between making unpalatable deals with regimes like Iran's, groups like Hezbollah, even groups like Hamas, which is the actual way conflicts end, political settlements between unpalatable groups, or keep trying. You turn it up to 10, it didn't work. You turn it up to 11. What do they want to turn it up to? Nuclear bombs on all these problematic groups around the region in the hopes that will somehow enable Israel and sort of maximalist United States to have their way. It just isn't possible, aside from the fact that it's wrong and inhumane.
Well, Thanassis Cambanis, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Good to talk to you, Ian.
And again, I'll be speaking with Thanassis Cambanis, who's a senior fellow at the Century Foundation and director of the Center for International Research and Policy, and until recently worked as a journalist based in Lebanon. And his latest books include A Privilege to Die Inside Hezbollah's Legions and Their Endless War Against Israel, and Shia Power Comes of Age, The Transformation of Islamist Politics in Iraq, 2003 to 2023. We're going to take a brief station break and back, examining what can be done to remove an increasingly mentally ill Trump from office when the only mechanism available requires a gutless Vance and a craven and cowardly Republican Congress to invoke the 25th Amendment.
عاد من رحلته الفصول بالأناشيد والوعود ويشيعون أنه كان أيامها يقول في شقوق الدجى أعود في شقوق الدجى أعود.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Dr. Alan Francis, Professor Emeritus and former Chair of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science at Duke University. He's the author of the award-winning international bestseller Saving Normal and the reference work Essentials of Psychiatric Diagnosis. And his latest book is Twilight of American Sanity. A psychiatrist analyzes the age of Trump, now out in an updated paperback version. Welcome to Background Briefing, Dr. Alan Francis.
Always a pleasure to be with you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And I've spoken to you over the years because it's been pretty clear that Donald Trump is mentally unstable and has some very evident pathologies, which we've discussed. But he does seem like he's deteriorating rather fast. And recently there was one of those horrible North Korean-style cabinet meetings where they did a round robin, all sycophantically praising the dear leader. And then he went on for 5 minutes talking about Sharpie pens. Well, just a few days ago, he topped that by speaking for over 8 minutes about Peruvian vipers and black mambas and their fangs on these snakes. And he's standing there next to Melania, who normally has a pretty vacant look on her face, but this time she sort of looked at him like, God, this guy is nuts. So what are we to do? It's all happening before our eyes, and our political class, particularly the Republicans, are absolutely despicable and gutless, and they've abandoned the prerogatives and necessity of the separation of powers in terms of the legislative branch and not checking the executive branch. So what's the path forward here? In other words, Alan, if you're a practicing psychiatrist and you've got a patient on your hands who's a danger to himself, his family, and the world, what do you do?
It's a tough call with psychiatric patients, and it's an impossible call when the psychiatric patient is the President of the United States. I think that one thing is very clear, that there will not be an effort on the part of Vice President Vance and of this sycophantic cabinet to declare Trump mentally incompetent. That the idea that the Constitution can help us here is made impossible by the fact that he's appointed people who are loyal to him, do or die, and he could be as crazy as a loon, and they would be saying he's fine. So I don't think that there's a constitutional cabinet kind of redress to what he's doing. He's eliminated all of the adults in the room. The world seems to fit his needs. So he has crazy fantasies, and somehow or other the world distorts itself in a way to satisfy those fantasies. So instead of being checked by any external regulatory body or any internal cognitive controls, he's totally himself now. And he's always been a terrific jerk. He has always said the most outrageous things. As he gets more power, more living in a fantasy world where everyone agrees with him, and the world seems to twist itself in knots to satisfy his every wish. And as he gets reduced cognitive functioning, which happens to all of us and may be happening to him as we speak, he is an absolute disaster. The only saving grace is the saying on Wall Street that Trump always chickens out. And so he makes these really horrid, vulgar, mean-spirited, cruel, miserable, disgusting statements. But luckily, so far at least, he does terrible things. The bombing of Iran, a terrible thing. It's stupid and also self-destructive and destructive. But when push comes to shove, he doesn't push the nuclear button. We've had two presidents who stayed in office when they were totally incompetent, Ronald Reagan and Woodrow Wilson. My expectation is that Trump will serve to the end of his term. And the only thing that we can hope for, and it's flimsy, but it's what we have, is the election results that are a resounding rejection of Trump, and a Supreme Court that finally realizes that they've given him a mandate to do really horrible things, and finally starts not voting for political loyalties, but voting for the welfare of the country and the guidance of the Constitution. This is a very ugly situation in our world with very few checks. And unless the election provides some and the Supreme Court provides others, we're in real trouble.
So what do you make of efforts by the minority head of the Judiciary Committee in the House, Jamie Raskin, who's organizing a commission to look into the invocation of the 25th Amendment? So far, I think he's got about 56 Democratic Congresspeople signed up.
Yeah, I don't think it'll have any meaningful political weight, but it may help people realize how nutty this whole thing is. Trump may or may not be crazy himself, but certainly he's driving our country crazy. And if people begin to realize that some of the things he says are not just sort of mean-spirited and lying and crude and ugly, but that they're also remarkably dangerous to the credibility of our country and to the credibility of our government and to the workings of our democratic institutions. If calling him crazy helps that, I'm all for it. I mean, on technical grounds, would he be declarable as crazy? Now, who knows? But certainly as a way of making clear to people that the things he's saying are crazy, the things he's doing are crazy, his impact on our country is crazy, and that we're crazy as a country to have 40% of the population being willing to go over the cliff to believe and support crazy wars, to accept Trump's statement that he's Jesus Christ's second coming, to not feel funny if you're a Catholic voting for someone who defies the Pope in a way that's so ignorant of the Bible and of Jesus' teaching. I think that we're in a position now that anything that makes people think twice about voting for a Republican, anything that gets people to realize that we need to have more checks and balances, and that means that even if they've been Republicans their whole lives, this is not their Republican Party. Trump, if someone's been a religious Catholic their whole life, they cannot vote for Donald Trump because he's completely distorting Jesus' teachings in the direction of imperialistic wars. I think that if Jamie Raskin getting a group of people to say that Donald Trump is certifiable and should be removed from office, even if that doesn't change anything in terms of how the cabinet works or the Congress works, if it just gets people thinking about how crazy this is, that we shouldn't normalize such crazy behaviors, such crazy policies, such crazy uh, deriding of the Pope, of anyone who's crossed him the slightest bit, even the people who he previously loved, even the people who got him in office, like Tucker Carlson, is suddenly evil because he doesn't agree with each and everything. I think we have to get that 40% of the population to worry enough about Trump's mental status and his imbalance, whatever you call it, so that they stay home or they vote for a Democrat. And basically, it's as simple as that, that at this point, whatever happens in the world, when I get up in the morning, how do I judge the news? Is this likely to reduce Trump's approval? Is this likely to provide guardrails in the election? Anything that's likely to make people worry about voting for a Republican at this point is part of the salvation of our country and of our world. Anything that keeps people in that 40%, and that solid 40%, is dangerous to our country.
So obviously the efforts by a lot of psychiatrists and mental health professionals, led by Dr. Bandy Lee at Yale, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump was the book that they wrote, and there have been subsequent additional psychiatrists joined in. It got kind of shut down or sidelined by the American Psychological Association, who invoked the Goldwater rule, which said you can't treat or pass judgment on somebody's mental health without actually treating them. But apparently there is another criteria that would apply to Trump, and that is the official diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. And that's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual created by the American Psychiatric Association. So what do you think of that category, the antisocial personality disorder?
Well, I actually wrote it, so I know it pretty well. And narcissistic is the other thing that's been applied to him. I think that I'm not worried about Goldwater rules. I think at this point, all mental health clinicians should worry more about the safety of our country than any rule that made sense when it was first applied to Goldwater 60 years ago, but we're in a different situation now. I also don't worry as much as I once did about use of labels loosely. I used to worry a tremendous amount that having mental patients lumped with Trump would be greatly stigmatizing to them because he's such a bad person, and mental patients are nice people. And I thought that it was a great mistake when I first discussed this 10 years ago to say that Trump was mentally ill, because that implied that all bad behavior was mental illness, and many people would draw the opposite conclusion, that mentally ill people were bad. Right now, I think anything that convinces people not to take Trump, not normalize Trump's behavior, not to take it lying down, to get out there, join protests, to convince neighbors and family and friends how crucial this election is. Anything that does that is valuable. And I think mental health clinicians speaking out about how crazy Trump's behavior is, I'm not worried about DSM criteria at this point. I think if that helps dissuade people, it's useful.
Well, Anthony Scaramucci is the former White House communication director. Obviously had a pretty brief tenure, but still he's known Trump for a long time. He just posted on the social media X platform, quote, "Here's the real question. Does he care about any of this? I would submit to everybody he does not. He's entered the nihilistic stage of his political career. The polls don't matter. The people don't matter. The consequences don't matter. This is the most dangerous version of this man." And what we know about the White House is that there's nobody, literally nobody, restraining him. And in fact, the normal cabinet members, like Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, first of all, that's all in the one person of Marco Rubio. Secretary of Defense is a complete joke, except that there's no adults around him. And they're afraid of him. Those that are around him are afraid of him. They simply cannot tell him that he's, General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, tried to warn him against going to war against Iran, but he was shunted aside. And normally adults like the National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense would support General Kane, but they don't because they're afraid of Trump. And the worst part of it, I think, is, Alan, that if you have a man like this leading this country, we know how easy it is for foreign leaders to manipulate him because he's such a wreck. And that's what Netanyahu did, manipulated him into getting into this war. others earlier on, like the Turkish dictator Erdogan rolled him. Putin rolled him at the Helsinki summit, where he believed Putin over his own intelligence advisors. And in this upcoming summit with Xi Jinping's going to roll him, because he knows, these people know how vulnerable he is to flattery and manipulation. So I think that's the real danger, isn't it? We have a guy that is leading this country and can be led by the nose by, some malign players out there who can easily manipulate him.
Yes, people who haven't seen it should see the original, not the remake of Manchurian Candidate. It's almost like we have a Manchurian Candidate as president. I agree with what Scaramouche said, except for maybe he's taking it a little bit further than I would. I think that Trump has the potential to be a total nihilist in the way that Hitler was towards the end of World War II, and that I think Trump would be perfectly happy at some point to have the world blow up after he dies. But I don't think he's there yet. And I think that there are checks that he responds to. He responds to the stock market. Even more, he'll respond to the bond market. And the unfortunate thing is the stock market exploded. It set a new record in the face of all the terrible things that are happening. If there had been a sustained stock market crash, I think he would have responded to it. He's not completely at the point of being unresponsive to things. I think he's still responsive to polls. I think he's still responsive to losing support. Makes him angry. He says stupid things in return, attacks even his previous supporters, shows no loyalty, but he hears it. So he's not at the stage where he has absolutely no contact with external possible checks. The problem is that those checks aren't being applied. If the stock market keeps going up, if we get the bond market doesn't scare him by having rapidly increased rates, if gas prices don't keep going up, I think he will feel like he won. And he will feel like what he did was perfectly reasonable within his context of understanding the world, because it will be Donald Trump winning and everyone else losing. I think he will translate what's really a terrible defeat in Iran into some sort of triumph. And in his world, everyone will agree with that. And so, again, I wake up in the morning, first thing I look at as I read the news is this going to help us in November or not? And when I think about what can I do each day, will this help further the chances of providing external constraints on Trump? And I think the country has to start seeing things in that light, and to start realizing that Trump himself can do things that will make life impossible for our children and our grandchildren. And that this is not a normal political campaign. This is not normal mudslinging amongst politicians. This is a tipping point for humanity. This election has tremendous importance. And I enjoin everyone to do their very best to make sure that every person who can vote for controlling Trump vote, and every person who would vote for allowing Trump to be Trump be punished and kicked out of office, and that we try to convince the middle people who are still on the fence to do what's right for America, to do what's right for their children and for their grandchildren.
Well, just in the last couple of minutes, though, the uptick in the markets was a result of Trump's statement that the Straits of Hormuz were open, that there was a ceasefire, and that's all magical thinking, because on Saturday things completely turned around. Obviously, the Iranian foreign minister that they're talking to is not really in control, and the Revolutionary Guard Corps are just turning tankers away and closing off the straits. And we're worse off than we were before Trump issued his magical thinking statement, which prompted the market to rally and oil prices to drop. But that's over. And that's what happens with this guy, because he doesn't know what he's doing.
Here's the really amazing thing. The stock market's supposed to be smart people. It turns out that the stock market is as stupid as can be. It responds to his words as if they're truth. And that's because it knows that people will respond, that will chase Trump's lies. Think of it from Trump's point of view. He has this amazing power never before held by anyone in the entire world to have the stock market jump 1 or 2% just on what he says casually on an airplane. So everything that happens fulfills his fantasy. He can make the stock market go up. He can make the stock market go down. Everything, every wish, every one of Trump's wish becomes the world's command. In terms of the world, we have to start acting like this is crazy. The stock market has to start thinking about what the future will hold for a country that's being so misgoverned, that these oil prices are not going to go down immediately. On the other hand, our enemies suddenly turn into geniuses. The Iranians are playing their hand beautifully. They're going to get tremendous concessions from Trump. He complained about the agreement that Obama made that was a very, very good agreement. He's complained about that for the last 15 years. He's written it, the last 12 years, he's written it to office. And now he's coming up with a much worse agreement, and he's going to claim that as a major victory. If the 40% of people who are willing to vote for him buy this, he will continue doing this from now until his death.
Right. Yeah, Obama's so-called sellout to Iran involved $400 million of money that was South Korean money that already, for oil that they'd already received. And Obama unfroze $400 million. And Trump says it was plane load full of cash, which is absolute bull. And then Trump is going to give them $20 billion as a bribe to get aboard some cosmetic deal so he can get out from under this mess that he's created. And on top of that, he's asking the Treasury Department through the IRS to give him $20 billion of our taxpayer money. If we give that SOB a dime, it's a sellout. I mean, they're going to compromise, probably give him $10 billion of taxpayer money. This is unbelievable extortion from this wrecking crew being rewarded by the taxpayer. I mean, we are really, the madness is on us, Alan.
I was exactly thinking that, Ian, exactly that thought. Who's crazy, him or us?
Well, I thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
Okay, always a pleasure.
And again, I've been speaking with Dr. Alan Francis, Professor Emeritus and former Chair of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science at Duke University. He's the author of the award-winning international bestseller Saving Normal and the reference work Essentials of Psychiatric Diagnosis. And his latest book is Twilight of American Sanity. The psychiatrist analyzes the age of Trump, now out in an updated paperback version. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon and Asher Price. And if you've missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can visit us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we'll include extended interviews searchable by topic and have made it easy for you to sign up for the daily email updates that provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. And you can find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media managers, Evan and Luke Susswood, are also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help us sustain this program into the future and assure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back again tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.